Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm going to explore a word that we all use but might never have thought about. That word is unreasonable. What do we mean when we say that someone is being unreasonable? My guest, Dr Kirsty Sedgman, is a doctor of audiences. That means she researches how audiences, for example in the theatre, behave and respond to the performance they're watching. More recently, Kirsty has turned that same lens onto other situations. For example, what we do on public transport, at work or in a cafe, to explore what being reasonable or unreasonable means. Through her research, Kirsty has discovered that the idea of being reasonable is deeply embedded in our moral and legal judgment system. It can often be subjective and influenced by personal biases. From theatre etiquette to crossing the road, there are rules and norms in place, sometimes for our safety, but sometimes because it's just the done thing. Now, these things can be useful, but they also have the potential to marginalise and exclude certain groups of people. As Kirsty explains, what is reasonable or unreasonable is actually a matter of perception, and that's relevant to how we all behave, how we judge the behaviour of others, and is highly relevant for those of us responsible for influencing human behaviour and mitigating human risk. Speaking of norms, if you're a regular listener to the show, you'll know that at this point I like to remind people that my new book, Humanising Rules, Bringing Behavioural Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out now. There are links to where you can find that in the show notes. But now let's get back to being unreasonable, and I found what Kirsty had to say absolutely fascinating. On several occasions while reading her book and listening to her, I felt incredibly seen. I suspect that on some level you will too. And I think that's a really good thing because sometimes we need to hold up a mirror to our own behaviour and judgments. So please enjoy my discussion with Dr Kirsty Sedgman on being unreasonable. Kirsty, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here because you've written a fabulous book and I can't wait to talk about it. But before we do that, you've got a title which I find absolutely fascinating, which is Doctor of Audiences. What does that mean?
Well, I'm actually a lecturer in theatre at the University of Bristol, but I absolutely am a doctor of audiences in that I got my PhD in audience studies at Aberystwyth University, working with the late, great Professor Martin Barker, who essentially invented audience research as a field of study alongside a bunch of other people. And really for me, what it means is that whether it's watching a Brecht play or a political phenomenon like the Brexit referendum, I am endlessly fascinated by how we can watch the same event unfolding but come to such radically different conclusions about what it means.
Wow. And there's so many things. So once upon a time, I studied Brecht, but I won't pretend to have read any recently. But you've brought all sorts of memories flooding back that may reappear later on the show. But I think that there's a really interesting story that's occurred recently in the UK. And for listeners outside the UK, I'll give a very quick summary, which is there was a musical called The Bodyguard, which is based on the movie that the people will have heard of. And there was a little bit of an incident there where they called the police and audience members were thrown out and you were asked to comment on this. And I guess the basic sort of tension here was between people who'd come to listen to the show and have talented singers dancers perform in front of them, and people who were there to kind of have a good time and wanted to sing along. And that, in its simplest term, is expression. Now, there was some inappropriate behaviour, it seems, on the part of the audience members that were thrown out. So it's not simply a case of people turning up and turning it into a karaoke event, but there is this tension between expectations and the audience. And I wonder, can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course, this is actually where my research into reasonableness all started. It was it was 8 years ago now when my first child, Monty, was born. And I suddenly, a professional theatre goer, realised that I couldn't go to the theatre anymore, at least not without the ability to detach my breasts and leave them at home. So I started at that time to notice a rise in use of a particular phrase, and that was theatre etiquette. There was this growing sense that at that same time that audiences have been getting increasingly badly behaved and need to be retrained in what it means to sit quietly in a theatre. And I got really fascinated by that. So I thought I might just start doing a little project. I was only going to write one little academic article about it. In the end, I ended up with an academic monograph, The Reasonable Audience, which studied the rules of behaviour in theatres, what different people think of as reasonable, where that mode of silent reverence came from in the first place. And I wrote that book, put it out there, and I thought I was done. I thought I'd said what I needed to say. And then lockdown happened. And I realized that all the things that I'd been writing about and studying and thinking about for years, surveillance and judgment and shame and how we police each other's behavior, and when that's a really good and moral thing to do because it's keeping everyone safe and making social life better for everyone, and when it can veer into unreasonable judgments weaponized against often marginalized people, I realized that that was playing out in every aspect of social life, particularly within lockdown.
Your start point here is that when we go to, and the theatre is just one example, right? We can pick other situations where we're with other people, where there are certain behaviors that are imposed, expected, required. And that's everything from what you wear to how much noise you make and how you react to the situation. That's the bit you started off looking at.
Absolutely. And the reason that I study theatre is not because I think it's either the best or the most important art form ever to have existed. I study theatre because it's a laboratory for what it means to be together. And when we become audiences at a theatre show, or even when we're sitting at home watching Netflix, or when we go out to the cinema, or take part in a sporting event, or go to a festival, we are continually having to negotiate the boundaries of successful coexistence in those spaces in a way that tells us an extraordinary amount about how we do that within every aspect of our lives.
And it's really interesting when you phrase it in those terms, because I guess like everybody else, you think, well, I'm buying a ticket to something or I'm going to something. And I guess the ticket changes dynamics slightly, particularly if we've paid for it, because then there are even more expectations. I put money behind this thing. But even if we've just put our time behind it, we're going to something for a reason. And so I guess we turn up with preconceptions about what that's going to mean. And I guess we probably on some level, we are thinking about our behavior, which is sort of, this is what I'm going to go and do. And then we may get swept up in the crowd. But even if we just sort of turn up this thing, there are preconceptions about what is going to happen.
There are, yes. And what I was really interested in is when it comes to the theatre particularly, where did those expectations of total stillness and complete silence come from in the first place? And I do take very seriously all the people who've told me over the years in my audience research about the power and the pleasure of sitting there in what Peter Brook calls the good kind of silence, where everyone is so attuned to that same point. He said that there is this extraordinary life. I take that really seriously. But through doing this research, I also came to take extremely seriously all the people who talk about being or feeling excluded from these experiences of wonderful togetherness, whether because they're neurodivergent or otherwise disabled and can't force their bodies into that particular model of normative silence, or the people like Dominique Morisseau, who's an amazing Black US playwright who talked about going to the theatre and being shushed and told off even when her behavior was exactly the same as the rich older white woman next to her. So these models of behavior are really complicated. And the other thing that I think it's important to acknowledge is that while nobody is saying that, say, working class audiences or marginalized audiences are incapable of being polite or quiet, absolutely not. We also need to face up to the fact that this idea that we should all sit in complete reverent silence in the theatre at all times came from a particular historical place, which was 19th century attempts to culture and civilize the masses in a way that led to the inadvertent exclusion of predominantly working class audiences from these high art experiences.
So it's a historical construct that we've carried through. But what's fascinating for me is that when I think about what one can define under theatre, we've got things that, generally speaking, where I would expect, based on my perceptions, I would expect reasonable amounts of silence. But then we've got things like sort of pantomime, another end of the spectrum, where audience participation is very much expected. If I think about comedy, it would be strange if the audience didn't laugh. So that even in that sort of construct of we need to behave in a particular way, there's a broad range of different expectations.
There are, yes. And there is a school of thought that I don't disagree with at all that says that actually maybe it should be up to the creative team involved to decide what kind of experience they want audiences to come and adhere to. But what we do know is that, for example, the relaxed performance movement, which was spearheaded by a brilliant Tourette's hero activist and performer called Jess Tom, who talked really movingly about being excluded from sitting there in an audience because of her physical and verbal tics. We know that those alternative shows where particularly autistic audiences and disabled audiences are encouraged to come and they can leave if they need to. The lights are often kept up. It's really good for people with babies. Those are still really few and far between. So what came to interest me in all this research is, what does it mean to decide that a particular mode of experience is normal? And who often gets shut out of those normative experiences? Why can't we have a broader range of experiences to suit everybody? Some complete dark, silent shows to suit people who want those kinds of experiences, but also other people, even other autistic people, who need complete silence and stillness in order to concentrate. Why can't we have those, as well as a broader range of sing-along shows for those who are hungering for a more exuberant form of participation?
And so this isn't sort of saying turn up and do what you want, but it's recognizing that there are different needs there. There are different, I guess, expectations, different ways of expressing joy. You mentioned in the book, for example, people with medical conditions who need to look at their phone to check. They've got some sort of tracking device on them to making sure that they're healthy. So they're looking at their phone in a way that somebody else might perceive to be rude because they're checking, as far as that person is checking text messages. And so you've got that. You've got, as you mentioned, people with Tourette's or other conditions where they may need to make noise or be what other people might deem to be disruptive. And so you're really saying it's not just about different forms of enjoyment. It's about saying, how do we allow people in who, through no fault of their own, are unable to conform to these conditioned behaviors?
Absolutely. I say really clearly that we need to draw a line. We need mechanisms for drawing lines to separate out appropriate from inappropriate behavior, acceptable from unacceptable, good from bad, legal from illegal, reasonable from unreasonable. We need those lines. Society requires them to function. We only have communities because we're able to draw those lines collectively. But I just want us to think a bit more carefully and critically about who historically has had the power to draw those lines and to set those rules, and who those rules have been built to benefit, and where there might perhaps be alternative ways of being together that could be better and kinder for everybody.
So you start from this looking at the theatre, and I would love to go and watch a play with you because I'd be fascinated to watch you watching the audience as much as what's going on stage. But you start with that, and we've talked about some of those sort of dynamics, and then you made this leap, as you were explaining, into saying, well, actually, this applies in a broader context. And so in the book, you take us from that theatre base and talk about things like breastfeeding in public and what is acceptable. And the bit I thought was really interesting was you're absolutely right. Is I have I guess when I'm thinking about my presence in the theatre or a football stadium or whatever, there's a little bit more thought to all about this environment, and I don't know if I'm more tolerant in those environments. Probably not, actually. But you rightly pointed out that cafes and train carriages and other areas where we meet people, we're applying similar sorts of rules ourselves. And so if I sit there and tut at someone that's got a screaming baby, it's the same dynamic as looking at someone in the theatre behaving in a strange way. And that read across I thought was fascinating.
Well, that's where On Being Unreasonable really came from. It grew out of all of the other work that I've been doing, and those early experiences of trying to breastfeed Monty and knowing that I was going to be judged by some people, no matter how discreetly I attempted to breastfeed, unless I decided to lock myself away in a toilet cubicle and try and perch there on the slippery surface for up to half an hour at a time on each side. I knew that I was going to be judged by other people. But all this really percolated into the book On Being Unreasonable, which is it's my third it's my third book, but it's the first that's actually for normal people to read, priced sensibly in bookshops, not just for a handful of nerdy academics like me. And that came really out of lockdown and sitting there at home, stuck inside with my two little kids and watching the uprisings on really around the globe, thinking about the way that people were talking about mass protest movement and each other's behavior. There was a rise in surveillance and policing and judging other people, that kind of curtain twitching that we saw, where people were snitching on their neighbours who might be living cramped up together in a tiny gardenless flat and decided to use their hour a day of exercise to play football with their kids, say, rather than go on a joyless walk. I thought about how benches were taped up in parks and how that urge to watch each other was both a really important pro-social thing, a way of keeping both ourselves and also other people safe. You know, how are they wearing their masks? Are they standing 2 meters or more away from me? But also, at its worst, that urge to watch and judge other people soured into a kind of puritanical, anti-fun backlash. And then I started joining the dots between that and the things that I'd been studying before, both in the theatre and beyond, about how what we call collective effervescence, that ability to gather together and engage in exuberant, joyous, sometimes quite loud, communal modes of fun, was being stamped out in every aspect of social life. And even when it comes to public demonstrations, there was a sense by a lot of people that things have gone too far. We need to control and repress everybody. And I thought about the language of people are going too far and who gets to decide.
And I think that word reasonable is really interesting because it's simple. We all understand it. But what you nicely unpick is that we all understand it on our own terms. It's a very, very subjective thing. And I think your illustration around the COVID piece it was a classic case of, I'm being very responsible and all these other people, right, they're either being ridiculously over compliant or they're being ridiculously irresponsible. And I'm being reasonable here. And you could really, the way you just depicted there is absolutely right. You could really see that. And I think that is sort of, it's not that made it appear because it's always been there, but I think that really brought it to the forefront and we all started to have to think about it. And so if I use terminology from my world, I always talk about COVID as the world's largest compliance exercise because suddenly we were all confronted with a new set of rules that were requiring us to make big changes in the way that we did things. And we all had a differing degrees of ability to comply with it in terms of medical conditions, in terms of whether we needed to go to somewhere physically to work, in terms of our preconceptions about whether we trusted the government. And so this, I think, really, it brought something that's always been there and bubbling to the fore. And I love the fact that you kind of grabbed hold of it in that way, because I think it's if one can take anything positive from COVID, this is a good example of something that was always there, but had a light shone on it.
Absolutely, yes. And what we found is that there were really high degrees of compliance here in the UK, up until Barnard Castlegate, when Dominic Cummings hopped in his car and went for a drive in order to, as he said, test that his eyesight was safe to drive. And after that, that's mutual sense that we really were all in it together began to fracture and break down. And this is not just me imposing my own ideals. On top of this, that studies have shown that that's when the UK started to lose faith in that idea that we were all keeping each other safe and that everybody was stuck in the same boat.
That's fascinating because I share your views on that, that I thought it was I'll try and be slightly polite and say unfortunate incident that wasn't helpful. But what you really highlighted in the book, and I had sort of almost a visceral reaction to remembering that time, was really that it did have a really, really big impact. And therefore, tone from the top and all these sorts of trite phrases that we hear, prime illustration that sort of broke down some of the relationships in it, but I hadn't quite grasped the severity of it and therefore the significance that event actually had.
Yes, and a lot of people have been studying and writing about this in a whole range of very clever ways. But for me, I am a scholar of discourse. I study talk. How do we talk about things? How do we reach for words to describe experiences that so often we might consider to be indescribable? And that's why I've framed my whole, really, the last nearly a decade of my career around interrogating the idea of reasonableness. Because I started to think, well, why do I keep using that word so much? Why not one of its synonyms like acceptable or appropriate? Why do I keep coming back to the idea of reasonableness? When I started to investigate it, well, first of all, it's because when Dominic Cummings took his drive, he and also the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson rationalised that what to us seemed quite an unreasonable decision away by using that word. They both said he acted reasonably. And when I started digging into the etymology of this word, I realized how inextricably embedded it is in our moral, but also our legal judgment system. So the idea of the reasonable man standard is something I talk a lot about in the book. What does it mean to be a reasonable person? Well, as far back as the ancient Greek, they were theorizing that the reasonable person was a man who was rational and able to logically address problems and work through solutions. And they basically invented this kind of mythical figure of a reasonable man who would be able to judge other people. And then when the law was being formalized, that's how we, first of all, had the reasonable man standard. And then that evolved into the reasonable person standard, a supposedly objective, neutral, benchmark, arbiter figure. But in practice, none of us are free from our particular biases and the things that we're able to see from our own subject positions. Actually, there are a great many cases where what a reasonable person thinks of as completely normal and reasonable and good is to another person actually deeply unreasonable in ways we can't necessarily see until we're in that position. And I do open up in the book about how I have fallen into that same trap myself. We all have. Before I had babies, not that I ever judged other women, but I was going to use a feeding blanket. I was going to cover myself and my baby up. I thought, well, why is that so hard? And then I talk in the book about how when I was doing it, I realized that I actually had to keep not just completely still and steady, but I had to keep my eyes fixed on what they call the latch to stop it from slipping and really quickly getting actually in excruciating agony and experiencing tissue damage. I started to realize how naive all of my so-called reasonable assumptions had been.
When you sort of describe it like that, there's an implicit presumption when we judge other people, it often on the basis of whether they are doing it deliberately, that they're setting out to make other, they're sort of being inconsiderate. And of course, there are people that are inconsiderate and do things that push that. And that gives us air cover, if you like, sometimes for these interpretations. But ultimately, as you explain in the book, it's not like the average parent getting on a plane with a kid is thinking, how can I make the kid scream so they can disrupt as many passengers as possible? And yet, and I've absolutely been guilty of this myself. And yet you sit there and sort of think, yeah, that's how it can come across and how we can perceive it. And so one of the things I thought was amazing about the book was I felt really seen as I was reading through. There were lots of times where, yeah, sort of if it was like not every single one, I hasten to add, but it was like a checklist for me of stuff I have done and preconceptions I've had. And I found it fascinating how when you start to, if one is honest about one's own behavior, that can happen so easily.
It can, because we're all living our own lives and we are living them in our particular systems of value that we've constructed, but also in particular bodies. So another example that I don't talk about in the book much, I think it was near the end of the writing process, I smushed my knee. That is the word that the surgeon used. I smushed my knee bone. That's not a
I'm
word.
laughing at the word, not the injury.
I know, that's not a word that you want your doctor to use when looking at your x-ray. Imagine the top of a courgette being pushed down by a thumb and crushed. That's what happened to my shin.
Yeah.
And I also snapped an ACL, so I was on crutches for quite a while. And I remember at that time, I think it was around the time they were changing the Green Cross Code to more formally allow people to cross the road wherever they'd like. And again, obsessed with discourse, can't stop studying the talk that circulates around these ways of changing our behavior. What I noticed was that lots of people going, well, why? Why can't people just wander down the road just a little bit further to crossing points where they can cross safely? Why should they be able to just launch themselves across the road wherever they choose? And then I remembered being on those crutches and just, a few extra dozen meters seeming an insurmountable distance. And I hadn't truly thought about that before, apart from pushing a pram around. You really do realize how hostile public pavements here in the UK are to people who rely on wheels to get around. But there's so much that you don't think about until you start living it. That said, as I mentioned, we do need a way to draw lines. One of the things I also tackle in the book is the common refrain, well, just people are getting increasingly selfish. And I look at how, from generation to generation, people over the past 2,000 years have been saying exactly the same thing about younger people. Plato was bemoaning the youth for not sitting quietly in the theatre all the way back then. And in fact, chapter 2 of the book is exploring what I call the disconnection economy, which is the way that social media and governmental policies have been determinedly since the 1970s encouraging us into neoliberal modes of thinking about individual personal responsibility for yourself and your family rather than a sense of collective responsibility to other people. So I do think that that's something that needs to be taken seriously. And we do absolutely need to fight back against the rising sense of you can't tell me what to do itis that we're seeing again, particularly post-lockdown. Don't tell me to wear masks. Don't tell me to have vaccines. I don't care about you. We have to take a stand against selfish arseholes rather than just saying anyone should be able to do whatever they like with no consequence. But at the same time, we also need to think carefully about where we are imposing our own judgments and our own values onto other people in a way that is potentially keeping oppressed people mired in oppression, keeping marginalized people pushed to the margins of society, keeping people down in a way that we might not even have thought about before.
That was one of the things that really struck me was as you opened my eyes to these dynamics, I was thinking, well, actually, well, isn't, for example, technology, that's a force for good, right? Because, and you talk in the book about transparency and this concept I'd never heard of before called surveillance, which I'll get you to talk about in a second, which on the one hand means we can expose wrongdoings by the authorities. Everybody has the opportunity, providing they have a mobile device and access to the internet, we can start sharing things that have never been shared before. And so that's very powerful in terms of driving social change and exposing injustice. Equally, you've got the opposite side, which is people can get, quote unquote, cancelled for one badly stated opinion, and people can be filmed in all sorts of things and exposed. And so there's a really interesting dynamic there around technology being a force for good, but simultaneously a force to perpetuate some of the inequalities that we have nowadays.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the traps we keep falling into societally. When we're talking about whatever it is, whether it's social media or the social contract itself, those norms and rules of behavior, or whether it's something like civic debates or manners or respect or civility and civilization, I think we keep risking falling into this binary conversation where things are either really good or really bad. But actually, all of those things are tools. Social media is a tool. The idea of manners is a tool. And that sounds really controversial, I know, but I explore that very carefully in the book because obviously manners are really a good thing when they're used to set out mutual terms of agreement that encourage people to be considerate of other people, to observe their behavior, to look around them, to think about other people and not just themselves. Then manners are really good. But also, I go in the book into a whole range of ways when historically manners and civility and propriety have been developed as a way to disempower and divide. And it's the same with things like social media. It's a tool. It depends how we use it and how we can avoid technology being used against us in ways that are often deliberately designed to encourage dissensus and angry debate rather than more productive and healthy forms of conversation.
And I love that reference to manners as in a sort of negative sense, because it really chimed with me as I think back to environments I've been in. And I've been reasonably privileged, so there are probably less of these that I've come across, but sort of, which cutlery to use and the etiquette around and being placed in situations where it's almost, it may not have been deliberate, but at least the construct felt like it was designed to make me look stupid. It's designed so that I will fail to do something, and therefore identify myself as not being from a certain grouping. And I really felt that myself. And I thought, well, if I'm feeling that, then it must be even harder for people that have not had the privilege I've had and been excluded from certain things. And so it really, really struck me. And it's, it's interesting that the language around manners is, well, obviously it's a good thing to have a good, and we put the word good in front of it, good manners. But you're absolutely right. There are lots of processes there that are not obvious and possibly not sensible even, that were created for, if I was being sort of cynical, I'd say created for precisely that reason.
Yes, and I don't think it's too cynical at all. In fact, it's one of the things that I explore in the book, those two contrary definitions of manners. So the first from Erasmus, of Rotterdam, his 1530 book on civility in young people, really started to lay down laws of observation, of thinking about other people, of looking towards other people and not just inwardly. And those are really quite good rules. Don't spit on your hands and then dunk them in a communal bowl of food, for example. That's a good rule. I think most of us could agree. But then we have that alternative idea of manners that's encoded in that word etiquette, which comes from the French estiquette, which means to attach. And it seems that that word came from the court of King Louis XIV, who stuck a bunch of placards around his palace, advising courtiers of the increasingly codified modes of behavior that they were to adopt in royal courts. And I use the analogy of the dining room table, not spitting on food or using a handkerchief if you need to sneeze while you're at the dining table, these are the kinds of rules that I'm telling my young children today, because they are going to keep other people safe and make life better for everyone. But the rules about the serried ranks of cutlery, that you should use the posh dining table, that wasn't really designed to keep anybody safe at all. Really, what those rules were designed to do is to show who belongs at the table and who doesn't.
And so the obvious question is, how do we determine, when we're looking at something? I mean, and as you make the point very clearly in the book, right? There's very clear extremities where it's blindingly obvious, but that's not where we have problems. It's in that grey area in the middle that's challenging. How do we start to make those distinctions and work out what's there for good purpose and what's there for bad purpose?
Well, really, the main problem that I interrogate using that word reasonable is the idea that any of this is simple or common sense at all. Because that is absolutely what I found in my discourse research, that whether it's theatre etiquette and how people should behave when they're watching a live performance, or what's the right way to breastfeed, or whether or not you should be allowed to bring children onto public transport and under what conditions, and how you should behave if they then kick up a fuss, or whether women should be allowed to apply makeup on trains. In all of those circumstances, what you find when people are talking about it, whether in person or online, there is this sense that each person needs to assert their ideal modes of behavior. And I talk about this as the reasonable tango because it goes back and forth. Well, of course, you can have children on a plane, but just make sure that you keep them quiet. Well, if you can't keep them quiet, then you should bring a screen for them to stare at. Oh, but actually, it's really bad that children are attached to screens all the time, so don't bring along a screen. It's fine, just put together a nice little goodie bag with some earplugs and dish them out to everybody who's potentially in earshot. And what I find is that everybody, I talked about those lines that we need to draw, everybody seems to draw those lines in slightly different places. Everybody is absolutely certain their precise drawing of the line is reasonable, and anyone who crosses it is therefore unreasonable. And I found that the first time that I explored this was in the theatre etiquette debate. I have a whole spiel about, I read all the theatre etiquette guides with these contrary advices. And it ranges from whether or not you should be allowed to take in phones. Some people say, absolutely not, leave them at home, switch them off. You're not allowed to even look at them. Other people say, well, if you've got kids at home and a babysitter is watching them and you don't feel able to come to the theatre otherwise, then put it on silent, take a couple of quick, discreet glances, that's fine. Some people say, no food at all in the theatre, completely forbidden. Surely you should be able to go an hour or two without masticating some kind of food stuff like an animal. Other people say, well, it's really unreasonable to expect everybody to avoid eating whatsoever, and you don't know, maybe if someone needs to suck on a sweet to keep their blood sugar levels up. So quiet snacks are okay. And dress codes, oh my goodness, that's a big one. Some people I found were saying that people can wear whatever they like at the theatre. Now the days of top hats and tails are gone. So rock up in whatever you feel comfortable in, jeans and flip-flops. Other people specifically said no jeans and flip-flops at the theatre because it'll diminish the specialness of the occasion for everybody else. So that urge to draw a line and to lay down really precise rules of behaviour is common to all of us. But I think maybe we don't realise quite how diverse the lines that we're drawing that seem reasonable to us might be.
And I love that in the context of sort of, if one is there as a, it applies to all of us in the sense of experiencing things and having views. And your views, as you highlight in the book, people are very, very clear in their views and very happy to express them and react accordingly when those expectations that those views promote are met. But if you're in the position of having to create those rules, then that makes it really challenging. And I was struck listening to you that we see this happening in global organizations, governments do this, where you sort of apply one rule to everybody, and it might be sensible in one location or for one business or for one culture. But actually, the broader the canvas on which you try to apply it, the more challenges you'll find where it's not suitable either socially or practically in a particular environment. And so because of this sense of, this is obviously a sensible rule, we're just going to deploy this, that can lead to some great challenges. And so the sorts of dynamics you're talking about, I see happening in corporate and governmental decision making all the time.
Absolutely. And I've worked with a range of arts organizations who are trying to make audience policies that will be robust enough to keep audiences and also, of course, their front of house staff, who are often the poorest paid in the sector, safe, which is of paramount importance, but at the same time, not actively being unwelcoming as a space to a range of audiences who historically have been shut out of these kinds of experiences. So it is a really tough thing to balance. But again, my contention isn't that therefore we should do nothing. I'm not arguing that we should let anyone do whatever they want. I'm just saying, could we please stop talking about these things as if it's simple? Because actually it's really incredibly morally and practically complex in a democratic society where we all have a voice to be able to figure out what we want that society to be like. It's the biggest challenge we're facing now. But also, can we please learn to have better, healthier conversations? Because just the past week, I've been trying to talk about the complexities involved in theatre etiquette, and yet I've still had a range of people boiling it down to the most simplistic take. Oh, you just think working class people can't behave, and therefore we should allow anyone to do whatever they like, which actually is really snobbish and elitist of you. Obviously, I'm not saying that. Or, oh, so you want everyone to sit down and shut up, no matter what kind of experience they might want. So you're keeping theatre elitist. We're not saying that either. It's really tempting. And in fact, I do argue that we are deliberately incentivized, particularly on social media, to engage with people in a hostile and angry way. It's really tempting to knee-jerk respond with what we think of as a reasonable position. And I think the hardest task ahead of us is to figure out how we can have productive kinds of conversation that don't weaponize the idea of civil debate in a way that is actively harming to marginalized people.
I love that. And there was a tweet I saw of yours, a Twitter thread, and I thought I could almost envisage you writing this thing because it was beautifully balanced and you were very clear. I'm saying this, I'm not saying that. And it by default, it had to be long because you were, and I could see you tiptoeing through this thing and making some really good points. And I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But I was fascinated by that because you're right. It's people will jump on whatever they want to see. And I think the nuanced position that you're taking on this, which if anybody reads the book or listens to, it's very clear, but it's very easy to take one extremity. You're either a fusty traditionalist or you're a radical who's to be kept out of these things, and ne'er the twain shall meet. And I think that's a really interesting example of where this is a nuanced debate, and we need to try and work our way through it. And so I've sort of, probably not enjoyable for you, but I've loved watching you navigate your way through that because I think that illustrates the scale of the problem.
It does make it harder to do things like this, though, because what so often is required is a nice, neat soundbite. And everyone hates the academic who just goes, actually, it's much more complicated than you think. I can hear myself saying it. I hate myself slightly for it. But
rest assured on this show, we like nuance and grey areas and complexity. I think understanding that it's difficult, I think, is the key bit, and recognizing that, because I think often when we try and codify these things, that's when we get into trouble. And so there's this desire for codification. If I look at something like ethics, it's very, very simple to say, well, we'll just have an ethical code. Yeah, but have you thought about all the situations in which that might need to apply? And if we codify something, it gives a force to it that will lead to all sorts of things. So we have to be really careful that we've captured the nuance and thought about times when what we're suggesting might not be applicable.
Absolutely. And I think I have become increasingly convinced, and I do hope that before people respond to this, they might read the argument in the book because I have to lay it out really carefully. But I've become increasingly convinced that the world we're living in now is harming more of us than it's helping. That idea of absolute repression that was integral to that civilizing project, that 19th century white supremacist anti-working class campaign to make everybody behave in ways that are decent and proper, what happened during that time is that genuine essence of community, where everyone is expected to look out for other people and to know that they'll look out for you in return, that really does require a less atomized, less isolated, more collective mode of being together. There are so many examples of how that kind of collective effervescence has been stamped out of every aspect of social life. And I list some of them. I go through them really quite carefully. Things like the 19th century campaigns to bring order to communities by getting rid of untidy wildflowers and imposing neat, sterile, actually very bad for the environment, lawns everywhere. The impulse to shame women, because it almost always was women who let children play in the streets, calling them gutter children. Whereas actually what they were doing was playing in their communities, and those communities were watching out collectively for those children. I can't imagine a world where I could let my children play on the streets without me being there having to watch them. And partially that's because of the ascendancy of cars, but also it's because of that gradual inculcation of an individual responsibility mindset. And again, I'm not saying that the idea of individual responsibility is itself bad. What we need to do is to find a balance. We need to think about how we draw that line between us all having responsibility to keep ourselves and our families safe, and also to bring them up in a way that means that they will make the world better for everybody. But we also need to refine a sense of collective responsibility and neighborliness that we're being incentivized away from.
Wow. For me, that's super powerful. And I think as you say, it is nuanced in the book. And I think it's really important for people to understand that it's not, you're not a fundamentalist on this. You recognize in the way that you present it, you're recognizing those great challenges. And that kind of takes me to another theme that clearly comes out in what you've said, but also you write in the book around rule breaking. And if we think about progress and what shifts us, and there's this sense of sort of people protesting and doing things is unreasonable, and we shouldn't be doing that. And yet we know that progress tends to happen when people do break rules. And we get those big, whether it's the suffragettes or whether it's other forms of protest that have developed big societal and social change. And I was struck really, and I knew I'd get him back in. I was struck, if I take Brecht as a good example from the world of theatre, there you've got somebody who's breaking conventions. And a lot of the things that he did are now sort of taken for granted, and we can see that carrying forward. And he's not the only one by any stretch of the imagination, but there is this idea of playing with rules and bending them and breaking them that seems to be essential to progress. And I think there's a lovely linkage between your broader theme and the theatre in.
Yeah, well, theatre is just one example of a public space. And I said earlier that theatre is this amazing laboratory for understanding what it means to figure out the rules of togetherness when we're all collected in particular spaces, but also it has historically, the arts more broadly and live performance particularly, have been a kind of canary in the coal mine. They've been an advance warning system for when much bigger socio-political frustrations are about to bubble up and spill over. And that's what we're seeing here today. I've been warning for years that this theatre etiquette situation is going to get worse before it gets better. And now here we are. We've just had our first theatre riots for quite some time. But this is absolutely happening everywhere. And it's because there is this sense of real anxiety that the world is falling into anarchy. That's when the 19th century campaigns to discipline audiences emerged, because at that time, what we were seeing was sudden migration to centres of industry. And elites really did think that the world was collapsing into anarchy. I talk about Matthew Arnold in the book, who is an extraordinarily influential poet, writer, cultural critic. He went on a kind of cross-Atlantic lecture tour telling everyone, society is falling into chaos, but don't worry, we can use culture to civilize people. But only if we get everybody to sit in the same place and shut up and received the blessings of perfection. He called it the best that has been thought or said in the world. And we're seeing, I think, a really prevalent sense of anxiety today that the world is again falling into anarchy. And we can see that across the political divide, particularly in America. We're seeing the increasingly far-right press stoke fears of crime in urban centres. Well, actually, crime is falling year on year. And in response, there is an urge to control everything and everyone. And if we're thinking about protest, we need to understand that I was writing this book in the wake of 2020 and the spree of protests around the world. And I was based in Bristol, so I was here in the city when Colston's statue got pulled from its pedestal and thrown in the harbour. And I was here again about a year later when we saw the Kill the Bill protests because the government was trying to crack down on civic demonstrations to give police powers to decide when they thought a protest had got too unruly or too disturbing or even just a bit too loud. And I think these political crackdowns against what is essentially, I think, a really democratic institution, the right to be able to say to governments, you are doing things that we don't like, we want you to stop now, to be able to collect in the street is a really important tool, and it's being stripped away from us. It's one of our fundamental rights to be able to do this. And it's really troubling.
Very, very powerful words, and I think backed up by things that you say in the book. I want to close out on a slightly lighter note, because one of the things that I did find amazing in the book as I went through it was it did make me smile a lot. And although the subject was incredibly serious, there were moments there where you picked elements that I just recognized. And whether that's talking about the website next door, which for people that aren't familiar with it, is sort of ostensibly it's a community site where people can ask questions and post events, and a sort of very positive thing, but it is a little bit of a sewer as well in terms of some of the things that you see in the sort of accusations and things that are hurled on there, and it's full of scams, all kinds of things. So it's like all these things. So I recognize bits of that. But you've got some lovely stories about you. And there's one in particular that I just wanted to focus on because I thought it was a lovely moment of sort of silly rebellion that made me smile a lot. And I think speaks volumes about you and the way you approach it, which was this, the scene that you had on a train and somebody else was putting makeup on. Can you just tell that story? Because I think it beautifully encapsulates your sort of approach and some of the light-hearted tone in the book.
Yeah, it was quite a way before lockdown, I think. I was on a train and there was a young woman opposite me who had been doing some of the most beautiful makeup work I'd ever seen. I was trying to look as if I wasn't watching her. Well, actually, I was taking notes. And she was only about halfway finished, I think, when an older white dude got on the train, sat down, took a look at her makeup bag on the table and said, I hope you're not planning to do that here. And she didn't say anything. She just looked mortified as she just kind of packed the makeup bag away. And I stared at him, and I wish I had told him to fuck off, to be honest. But what I did was take out my own lipstick and draw on some violent crimson lip. Unfortunately, I was looking him dead in the eyes rather than staring at a mirror. So that, in retrospect, was not the most aesthetically sensible of decisions. But since then, in and through the process of writing this book, as someone with an anxiety disorder who has been brought up to not cause a scene, to not call things out because it's rude. It's more rude to call out an injustice than it is to perpetuate the injustice silently. As someone who has been, as a woman, taught to make myself smaller and to try to fit in wherever possible, and I write not at length, but I do talk about having an invisible disability that has made that harder at times. I do find it really hard to stand up and to say what I think is often the right thing. But since then, I was on another train post-lockdown, And there was a woman with a baby. The baby was howling. She was trying to feed it, but it wasn't having any of it. And there were a couple of young lads, or actually a small table full of young lads, and they were getting performatively more and more angry until one of them said quite loudly, "Oh, the babies." And before I knew what I was doing, I blurted out, "Shut up! You have no idea how hard it is to bring a small, uncontrollable infant into public space. You can see that she's doing the best she can, and the absolute last thing she needs is your recriminations." And then I thought, oh God, what have I done? There are definitely more of them than there are of me. But he, to his credit, he looked really shamefaced and went, "I'm really sorry. I've got a hangover. I shouldn't have said that." I was like, yeah, you're a good lad. Don't do it again.
But that's all. I think. Thank you for telling that in the way that you did. Right. So that's nice, as we'd expect, theatrical and beautifully rendered. It's a really nice illustration, I think, of the sort of the social pressures on us. We feel like we can't say anything, and so what should I do? What can I do? And so I'm really appreciative of campaigns like the ones that I've seen in the UK recently around what to do if you see someone being harassed, and how to help, and recognizing that it's not always easy for people and that we don't always sort of react in the way that we might want. So having a plan for how to do that, I think, becomes very important. Giving people a script, if you like, to follow when these situations arise, I think is a really powerful initiative. And so as you were talking there, it really struck me that we do need people to speak up, but we have to recognize that that's difficult and challenging, precisely because of some of these dynamics you've talked about. It feels socially awkward.
It is difficult. It's challenging. It's messy. But also, again, we have to think about the other side of the coin, which is there are a whole bunch of people who have been speaking up because they think that somebody else is behaving in a way that is inappropriate. And very often what happens is those turn into viral videos where it's a white person who is zealously weaponizing their own sense of reasonableness to question whether a person of color belongs in that space, or are they stealing from that car? That was something that happened in Bristol during lockdown, I think. There was a black guy who was cleaning out his car and a white woman came up going, "Is this your car? Can you tell me the number plates?" So we have to be really careful about that urge to wade in and to control and to protect, because it's both a good and moral impulse to stand up for what you think is right, but also something that can be really heinously weaponized against a group of people that can be truly harmful. And it's really hard to figure this out as a collective, but we're never going to be able to work these problems through if we can't have proper conversations. And also if we're told, well, if you see something bad happening, then you must never step in.
Right, and that you've beautifully stopped my next question, which is, how do we solve this? Right, how do we recognize that? And I guess what you're saying is let's just be honest about the challenge facing us.
That's right, yes. And also to be able to think critically about relations of power. That's one of the things that I look at in the book quite a lot. Because if, as I believe, good faith conversations are fragmenting and civil debate is being weaponized to stall progress, then what's the solution? How can we have these conversations? Well, in certain cases, I do say that we need to stop weighing both sides equally, because in order for public reason, which is a mechanism for working through these problems in the public square, in order for that to work, we need to get much more comfortable with acknowledging that there are and there have been uneven operations of power, and sometimes we might need to make reasonable accommodations to rebalance it. Because if we want to get back to those truly reasonable moral principles like compassion and integrity and human dignity for everyone, sometimes we might need to reject the appearance of respectability. The appearance of respectability, not respectability itself, and certainly not respect. But that idea that in order to be a good and moral person, we need to appear proper and decent and respectable, rather than actually being morally decent and respectful. And that's the only way, I think, that we're going to build a genuinely reasonable world in which everyone has an equitable chance to thrive?
So many other questions, but time, as ever, with these fascinating conversations, Kirsty, is against us. Final question is you're clearly on a mission, and I mean that in a really positive sense. And the book's out there doing sterling work and is a cracking read, and links as ever to that in the show notes. So, what's next for you?
Well, I have been told more than once that my work is radical or dangerous, or for some people, even an assault on democracy itself. But that's absolutely not the intention, because, as I say in the conclusion, the message really is about as old and democratic as it gets. And this is the message that I want to keep hammering home. I think that this has been my life's work. Just think a bit more carefully and critically about what it means to judge other people. Before we subject other people to our judgments, think about what we're doing. Are we reinforcing historical injustices, or are we challenging? Are we solidifying power relations, or are we trying to subvert those? This is fundamentally about protecting people's fundamental rights to live their lives with dignity. Now, am I doing that? Or when I'm imposing my value systems onto others, am I destroying other people's lives and rights and dignity through the imposition of my own belief? The big question that I want us to ask ourselves is, am I pulling people up with my reasonable judgment about what it means to be together and how we should all behave? Or am I squashing them back down? Because if, as I believe, we're living in a world where we're increasingly encouraged to be divided about both our behaviors, but also our core fundamental belief, and we're all encouraged to think about our values as the reasonable ones, then how can we figure out what's right? And I think that what I'm always hoping to do is, by studying language as we argue these things out together, as we reach consensus, or as increasingly often we fragment and divide into polarized positions, by studying that process in action, we can get a sense of how people form those fundamental value systems in action. And maybe that kind of knowledge could be an antidote to the problems that we're facing today.
Wow. That is a wonderful note, and I think a very, very clear vision about things that sums up all the things you've talked about. So I want to say, firstly, thank you for writing the book, because it genuinely, it's one of those ones I want to read again, because it's blown my mind on so many occasions. And as I said to you earlier on, I have felt seen, but I think in a really healthy way, in the sense of it's encouraging me to challenge myself and challenge some of the societal norms, and particularly where I'm involved in creating rules or working out what rules make sense. I think the work that you've highlighted, I think, is incredibly powerful. So thank you for that. Thank you also for being an amazing guest on the podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself, and I've learned a lot.
Thank you so much for reading the book, and also for having me. It's been a pleasure.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Kirsty for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Kirsty, her research, and her book, Being Unreasonable, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. You'll also find links to my book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance. If you're one of the people that's been kind enough to buy the book, one of the things that you can really do to help is to leave a review on whichever bookstore you bought it from. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, thank you so much. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon, but in the meantime, stay safe, try and be reasonable, and thank you so much for listening.